Attention all wing pilots. Stand by to receive orders.
Star Wars Arcade was a Sega 32X launch title, and it was a port of, you guessed it, an arcade game. While the game isn't great, in fact, it's somewhere between mediocre and kind of good, it was one of the better games for the 32X, simply because the 32X just didn't have a lot of good games, and that's primarily one of the reasons why the system failed as bad as it did. In Star Wars 32X, you and a friend take control of one of the ships in the Star Wars universe. When you play in two-player mode, one of you can fly the ship and the other shoots. When you play in single player, you fly and shoot by yourself, which is how most people played, because I really don't know how many people actually had this game, and on top of that, how many people actually had a friend to play this game with them. I'm almost certain, since the time this game came out, not more than 500 people actually played this game with the two-player option on their 32X console. The game's story has you flying around in space in a first-person 3D view and shooting a bunch of enemy starfighters. The controls are pretty smooth, but the game did come with the original arcade version inside of the game, so it's basically like two games in one, although the games are more or less identical. I did notice one thing. The arcade version, maybe this is just me not having enough coffee in the morning, but I did feel like the arcade version handled a little better. Like, it was slightly smoother. And that's not to say the actual console version handled poorly. It handles pretty good for a game of its time and of its genre. But still, the arcade just felt a little bit better. It's barely noticeable though, and aside from a few aesthetic differences, the games are more or less identical clones of each other. There's really not much more to say about this game. What you see is what you get. Pretty decent graphics for the time, pretty good controls, and fun first-person space combat action. You use your radar to track enemy ships, you can slow down and speed up with the A and B buttons, and you shoot with the C button. Why do you need to slow down and speed up? Well, that's where the game's strategy comes in. Sometimes there are enemies behind you, so you slow down a little bit and let them pass and shoot them from the back. Sometimes enemies are ahead of you and you try to catch up with them by actually speeding up, but that's more or less a lost cause because it seems like most of the enemy ships are a lot faster than you, so you might be able to catch up a little bit, but you'll never really catch an enemy ship. And I'm not just talking about speed, I'm also talking about maneuverability. Your ship is more like this big, cumbersome grandpa on a porch with his automatic rifle, and all the enemy ships are like tiny little ninja kids running around his pumpkin farm trying to chuck little rocks at him. You can't catch them, but force knows you can shoot them down. It's hard for me to call this a good game, because honestly and realistically, it's not a good game. But it's definitely better than okay. So my score for this game would probably be in the 6.9 to 7.3 out of 10 range. And maybe that's being a little too analytical with the score, but that's just the way I feel about the game. Like I said, it's one of the better 32X games, and that's not saying a lot because I think there are just under 40 32X games, and a lot of them simply weren't good, and those that could have been good didn't work very well. Because the 32X, you see, wasn't just a console, it was an add-on to an older generation console. You basically have this big thing, and you just stick it into your Sega Genesis, and now you're able to play these 32X games. I think that's actually one of the reasons the 32X failed. Well, there's so many reasons. I mean, I could go off on a separate video on its own, but one of the reasons is simply because there weren't a lot of games. But again, that's just a reaction to the fact that there weren't a lot of games because people weren't buying the console, developers didn't want to put a bunch of time and effort into making games for the console. And also, I believe the actual console in like 4 different quotations, it wasn't even sold as a console, it was kind of sold as an in-between thing. I feel like even the developers didn't have a lot of faith in it, especially because the Sega Saturn was coming out just, a few months or a year later. Star Wars Arcade for the 32X is ultimately a part of gaming history, a complex part of gaming history, the type you can't really pinpoint as good or bad. It's just there. It's kind of like some of the more maniacal, crazy, and violent kings of the medieval ages. They did some good, but they also did a lot of bad. So were they tyrants or were they just doing their job? It's all a matter of opinion. Go check the game out and see for yourself. Hey, maybe you can help me out with the score, since I'm so reluctant to actually pinpoint whether this is good or bad. Thanks for watching. Goodbye, my friends.